For a lot of people, the Cold War was a fight between freedom and tyranny, good and evil. But what if I told you that Britain and America played a crucial role in the rise to power of a genocidal regime in the Indonesian archipelago, a regime that ultimately was responsible for the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of innocent people? Following the events of the Second World War and the division of Europe, the Americans sought to contain the spread of communism. This became known as the Truman Doctrine, named after President Truman, who was extremely anti-communist and anti-Soviet. Understandably, much of the Cold War historiography has focused on Europe and the role of NATO, an anti-communist alliance of nations that were united in their opposition to Soviet aggression. For this reason, when many people think of the Cold War, they think of the Iron Curtain and the Berlin Wall. This is understandable for people in the West, considering that the Cold War did not really affect them that much, unless they were planning on visiting Eastern Europe or had family there. For the people of Asia, however, the Cold War was far more real and deadly. It is often forgotten that 5 million people died in the Korean War alone. Other conflicts in Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, the Philippines, Myanmar, Malaysia and Indonesia resulted in the deaths of countless others. These conflicts were often proxy wars between the United States, the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union. With neither side willing to compromise, the real victims of this ideological war were the people of Southeast Asia. For many strategists in Washington and Langley, Asia was the main arena of the Cold War, with China being a massive threat. Following China's military intervention in the meat grinder that was the Korean War, the US was reluctant to militarily intervene in other Asian nations, for fear that China would respond in kind and with overwhelming numbers. This attitude was shared by President Eisenhower, who preferred to use covert operations to achieve his aims. Thus, under his administration, the Central Intelligence Agency played a significant role in achieving foreign policy agendas, without the President's full knowledge, of course. It must be remembered, however, that at this time the Soviet Union and China were not always on the same side. By the 1960s, they were supporting opposite factions in Southeast Asia, with the Soviets supporting Ho Chi Minh's communists in Vietnam and China supporting the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia in the 70s. Despite the conflict between communist powers, the US continued to fear the international spread of communism. Western leaders believed that once communism gained a foothold in a nation, its neighbors would quickly be infiltrated, overrun, and seized by communists. Much like a row of standing dominoes topples, one knocking over the next until all have fallen. Domino theory greatly influenced President Johnson's decision to intervene militarily in Vietnam. This was greatly opposed during the time by figures in the civil rights movement who felt that Johnson's priorities were wrong. African Americans, the view was, should not be forced to fight for a country where they faced racial discrimination in public life. What most people did not know at the time, however, was that something equally, if not more, reprehensible was happening in another Southeast Asian country. I'm talking, of course, about Indonesia, where in 1965 the CIA and MI6 facilitated in a military takeover of the country, resulting in the systematic killing of an estimated 500,000 people associated with the Indonesian Communist Party. Following Japan's defeat at the end of the Second World War, Indonesia, which had been under Japanese occupation, declared itself to be an independent republic. This was bitterly resisted by their colonial masters, the Dutch, who with British help attempted to reclaim control of the islands. This led to a brutal 4-year-long war, the result being over 100,000 military and civilian casualties. While the Dutch achieved a military victory, they eventually realized that they could no longer control the nation and had to cede it independence. Led by its first president, Sukarno, Indonesia was quick to establish itself on the world stage, with the country taking a firm anti-imperialist stance as part of the non-aligned movement, a bloc of nations that opposed both Soviet and American influence. At this time, as part of compromise with the Dutch, Indonesia adopted a new federal constitution that made the country a federal state called the Republic of United States of Indonesia, consisting of the Republic of Indonesia, whose borders were determined by the Van Mook Line, along with the 6 states and 9 autonomous territories created by the Dutch. During the first half of the 1950s, these states gradually dissolved themselves as the Dutch military that previously propped them up was withdrawn. In August 1950, with the last state, the state of East Indonesia, dissolving itself, Sukarno declared a unitary republic of Indonesia based on the newly formulated Provisional Constitution of 1950. Part of President Sukarno's vision was for a greater Indonesia that would unite with a culturally similar Malaysia, which at the time was fighting its own war of independence against the British. The British did not agree with Sukarno's vision, and this led to the Indonesia-Malaysia confrontation, which involved Indonesian communist infiltrations into Malaysian territory on the island of Borneo. To deter and disrupt Indonesia's growing campaign of infiltrations, the British responded in 1964 by launching their own covert operations into Indonesian Kalimantan under the codename Operation Claret. MI6 is also now known to have conducted a number of black propaganda operations which included clandestine radio broadcasts being transmitted into the country that incited violence against communists. British Foreign Office documents declassified in 2021 revealed that Harold Wilson's Labour government had instructed propaganda specialists from the Foreign Office to send hundreds of inflammatory pamphlets to leading anti-communists in Indonesia, inciting them to kill the Foreign Minister, Subandrio, and claiming that ethnic Chinese Indonesians deserved the violence meted out to them. At this time, the Indonesian Communist Party was gaining more and more influence in Indonesia and was the third largest communist party in the world. By 1965, the Indonesian Communist Party had begun arming peasants, and many feared that they were about to take over the country in an armed revolution. But in situations such as this, you can always count on the right-wing military to put an end to such revolutionary activity. Following the assassination of 6 army generals by dissident members of the Indonesian armed forces, the right-wing General Suharto quickly took control of the country and accused the communists of attempting a coup. Quick question, do these men look like the good guys? Please let me know what you think. Communists were purged from political, social and military life, and the Indonesian Communist Party itself was disbanded and banned. Mass killings began in October 1965 in the weeks following the coup attempt, and reached their peak over the remainder of the year before subsiding in the early months of 1966. They started in the capital Jakarta and spread to Central and East Java and later Bali. Thousands of local vigilantes and army units killed actual and alleged communist members. Killings occurred across the country, with the most intense in the communist strongholds of Central Java, East Java, Bali and Northern Sumatra. Jeffrey B. Robinson, professor of history at UCLA, posits that, based on documentary evidence, powerful foreign states, in particular the United States, Great Britain and their allies, were instrumental in facilitating and encouraging the Indonesian army's campaign of mass killing, and without such support, the killings would not have happened. While the exact role of the US government during the massacres remains obscured by still leaked government archives on Indonesia for this period, it is known that, at a minimum, the US government supplied money and communications equipment to the Indonesian army that facilitated the mass killings, gave 50 million rupiah to the KAP Gestapo death squad, and provided targeted names of thousands of alleged communist leaders to the Indonesian army. As Robert J. Martens, political officer at the US Embassy in Jakarta, said in an interview with Kathy Cardane in 1990, it really was a big help to the army. They probably killed a lot of people, and I probably have a lot of blood on my hands. But that's not all bad. There's a time when you have to strike hard, and at a decisive moment. What made this atrocity a genocide, rather than just a politically aimed purge of the communists, was the fact that religious and ethnic minorities were targeted. This included ethnic Javanese in Sumatra, ethnic Chinese, and Dibangan Muslims. who made up most of the people slaughtered in the killings. These mass killings were carried out mostly by civilian groups and local militias, organized, trained and supplied by the Indonesian army. Although some communist branches organized resistance and reprisal killings, most went passively to their deaths. If you go to Bali today on holiday, you may end up sunbathing on top of mass graves. For several months in 1965, militia death squads went through the villages, capturing suspects and taking them away. Hundreds of houses belonging to communists and their relatives were burnt down, with occupants being butchered as they ran from their homes. An early estimate suggested that 50,000 people, including women and children, were killed in this operation alone. Between December 1965 and early 1966, an estimated 80,000 Balinese were killed, roughly 5% of the island's population at the time, and proportionally more than anywhere else in Indonesia. One decade later, in 1975, a similar atrocity was carried out in East Timor. After the collapse of the Portuguese Empire, many in Washington feared that their newly independent former colony, East Timor, would turn to communism. General Suharto, who by now had replaced Sukarno as Indonesia's dictator, used the opportunity to launch an invasion of the Catholic country and set in motion another genocide, this time against the people of another nation. From the start of the invasion in August 1975, Indonesian army forces engaged in the wholesale massacre of Timorese civilians. Those who survived the initial killings were forced into internment camps where many died of starvation, disease and malnutrition. Overall, roughly 1/3 of the population of East Timor were killed as a result of the invasion. The initial invasion and occupation of East Timor was supported by many anti-communist nations who wanted to keep Indonesia as a strategic ally against China and the Soviet Union. On the day before the invasion, US President Gerald R. Ford and US Secretary of State Henry A. Kissinger met with Indonesian President Suharto and reportedly gave their approval for the invasion. The US also hoped the invasion would be swift and not involve protracted resistance. "It is important that whatever you do succeeds quickly," Kissinger said to Suharto. The US supplied weapons to Indonesia during the invasion and the subsequent occupation. A week after the invasion of East Timor, the National Security Council prepared an analysis which found widespread use of US-supplied military equipment. After suffering from decades of violence and state terror, East Timor eventually achieved independence, electing their first president in 2001. But the effects of the genocide cannot be overstated. Within Indonesia, there is an unwillingness to discuss this genocidal past. The killings are skipped over in most Indonesian histories and have been scarcely examined by Indonesians and has received comparatively little international attention. Indonesian textbooks typically depict the killings as a patriotic campaign that resulted in less than 80,000 deaths. The man primarily responsible for the Indonesian mass killings and the East Timor genocide was President Suharto. By the time of his death in 2008, few people acknowledged him as a mass murderer. Minutes after his death, then Indonesian President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono held a news conference declaring Suharto as one of Indonesia's best sons, and invited the country to give the highest respect and honour to the ex-president. This was followed by a week of national mourning. This was despite the fact that throughout his life he was responsible for the killing of at least 700,000 Indonesians and East Timorese. Although mostly unknown in the West, compared to the Vietnam War and the various right-wing coups in Latin America, the 1965–66 Indonesian massacres and Suharto's rise to power are considered by historians to be a significant turning point in the Cold War. To this day, The Indonesian Communist Party is still banned. The Indonesian left, the trade unions, and the peasant movements simply never recovered. Relatives of the victims who are still alive today are unable to mourn in public without fear of being attacked. The anti-communist executioners who killed their relatives are treated like heroes, none of whom have been prosecuted or made to face justice for their actions. It is crucial that we remember the past, because the way we view the past influences how we view the world today. As George Orwell wrote in 1984, "He who controls the past controls the future. He who controls the present controls the past." Thank you for watching. I hope you found this video interesting and informative. Please don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. Also, please leave a comment and let me know what you thought of this video. Bye for now.